basically number of floating point operations per second. Now, one important thing what we need to realize is that these flops, that floating point operations per second, can be used to characterize a computing system. So that is what we looked into in our previous lecture. That is the peak theoretical performance of the architecture, and it can also be used to characterize a program. So this is very important to realize that these flops can be used to characterize both. I mean, your computing system, which has been given to you, and you can use the same measure. I mean, flops to characterize the program. So that is actual performance of the program in terms of how many floating point operations your program is doing per second, and then we can match. I mean, how close they are with each other. Okay, so that is what we did in our previous lecture. Okay, so today what we are going to do, we are going to look into some of the important trends in HPC, and subsequently we'll like to understand how these trends are actually evolving with time. That is very important. So what are the driving forces behind that evolution, and what are the future trends also? And then we can uh, take that knowledgeable direction on how to write proper codes based on the current trends and the future trends. Okay, so first let us look into the performance actually. So till now we have been talking about performance, so just let's look into how this performance is actually evolving over a period of time. So we can just look into the evolution for 20 years. This plot is little old actually, so I took this plot from this paper. But overall this trend is actually same. So you can just you can see that from 1993 to 2013, so for 20 years the trend was like this, and even today the trend continues to be like that. So there is no major change in the trend. So what is important to notice here, if you look into 1993, okay, so at this point of time, so here your y-axis is in gigaflops, okay, and x-axis is year. So in 1993, the systems used to be less than 1 gigaflop. So that is like their top 500 computers. So these are like these three colors, like blue color. So this blue color is for the sum of all the top 500 supercomputers in the world. The red color is the number one supercomputer in the world at a given year, and the green color is the number 500. So the number five ranked 500 in the supercomputing top supercomputers in the world list. Now if you look into this number one computer, so you can see in 1993, so you can see 100 gigaflops, 100 gigaflops. So that is what almost your laptop or desktop can deliver today, because we did that calculation in our previous lecture. So you can see the computer which used to be the best computer in the world in 1993, now that has become a commodity technology. So all of us has that in our hand. Even a very high-end mobile phone can give you like 100 gigaflops, because there is nothing called single core nowadays. So there is a lot of improvement in the performance. And if you look into the trend, I mean, it was predicted almost at 2000, 5 6 years back, that if we continue with this trend, so we are going to get an exaflop. Okay, so exaflop is like 10 to the power 18. Okay, so petaflop is 10 to the power 15, and exaflop is 10 to the power 18. And it has really been achieved. So by a Japanese computer recently, I think just few months back. This is the first exaflop computer in the world, which is a Japanese computer. So they have achieved this actually in 2020, and now we are going to see several exaflop computers in coming years. So we can see that this significant growth in computing power over the years, and hopefully this growth will keep on continue, and this is contributing a lot to the development in science and engineering. Now, let's understand what are the driving forces behind this evolution, this remarkable evolution, I mean, and how things have changed actually in between. Okay, now this is a very, very important slide to really understand from both, I mean, computing perspective as well as the architecture perspective. So first let us look into the x-axis. So x-axis is basically your timeline. So it is like almost you can see 45 years, close to 45 years in the x-axis. In the y-axis, it's a arbitrary unit. So it's there is no unit as such. It's arbitrary units. But then we are plotting four parameters here. So this one, this blue color is transistor count. So number of transistors. The green one, this one is the core count. The star, that is the sky blue color, this is the frequency. So this is the frequency, and this plus addition sign, which is in gray color, is the power actually. Now, the most interesting thing what we have to see here is this point actually. If I draw a line here, somewhere here actually, now we can see almost till 2004, till this point, I mean, everything was serial. So if you look into the green color, which is actually the core count, number of cores. So number of cores used to be only single core. So till 2004, there was only single core machines. Okay. Now this one, transistor count. So this is this line, this top line. So this is increasing as per Moore's law. So transistors are always increasing, and it is going to increase even in future. Now, where the transistors are going, that we have to understand. So initially, when you are increasing your transistor count, so you can see the transistors were primarily growing in increasing the frequency. So this is the place actually, this curve actually. So if you look into this curve, so you can see the slope was very high here actually. So the most of the transistors were going in increasing the frequency of the processor. Okay, so it was almost like the programmers did not worry actually. Programmers did not worry. Their job was just to write codes, and automatically the performance was coming from the hardware because your frequency was increasing. Now suddenly, beyond 2005, what happened is that you can see there is a plateau actually. So this has saturated now, so there is no more increase in frequency. So if you look into this point here, so that is 10 to the power 3. Okay, and your frequency is megahertz. So 10 to the power 6 into 10 to the power 3, so that is like gigahertz. So you can see that for last 15 years almost, we are making processors in gigahertz range. I mean, even today, I mean, the processors are all of gigahertz. I mean, 2.5, 3, 3.5, not beyond that. And why that happened actually, because if we would have continued doing the same thing, if we had kept on increasing the frequency like this, so at this point, the temperature of the processor would have reached almost the temperature which is present at the surface of the sun. So that kind of temperature we would have reached if we had have continued with the same trend. If we had continued increasing the frequency, then it was almost like an unmanageable temperature. The temperature would have been like the temperature at the surface of the sun. So one thing was very clear almost 15 years back, that now we cannot increase the frequency simply, because so that way is, that path is closed. Now we cannot increase the frequency of the processor even more, because that is going to burn the processor. So however, you can keep on increasing the number of transistors. So how those transistors can be accommodated? Okay, so very intelligent thinking was done, that we can accommodate those transistors in increasing the number of cores, and that's what we can see the trends now. So in 2013, you can see that this has already reached 10, and now it is I mean, all of us know that this has reached significantly higher with GPUs. Like you have several thousand cores. Even in CPUs, you have close to like 100 cores per processor. Okay, so one thing is pretty clear, and you can see the power is more or less, it has been also stabilized. So that is also very interesting. I mean, the power has more or less stabilized, so not a big worry there. So one thing which this plot establishes is that It's no more serial world. So today, even if you pay money, you cannot get a processor with single core. So it's absolutely a parallel world. So whatever processors are available today or going to be available in the future are all going to be multi-core processors. So they are designed to for parallel programming. So I need to know how to work with these instruments, these processors. Okay, so I hope all of you have understood the importance of this curve. Any questions for this particular plot? Hello.
No questions.
Okay, fine. Okay. So you keep on responding so that I know that you're still connected. Okay. Okay. Now, this is a simple slide. I mean, just to tell what are the applications of high performance computing. So we can see there are several applications starting from science and engineering, natural sciences to industrial commercial applications to financial modeling to all kinds of uh, defense, and nowadays with machine learning and data science, there's a lot of applications. So I'm not spending too much time, but this is a very interesting slide. Actually, I just took it from the internet. So now you see how over the years the job trends have changed actually, and this is very interesting in the sense that I mean still 2009. I mean there was hardly any job. This is taken from Monster.com, and then suddenly this started appearing. The performance, the people are looking for software developers who knows how to improve performance, and there is a significant rise. I mean 30%. Similarly, people in the job market also, there is a huge demand for people who knows how to optimize code, who people who know, I mean software developers who know parallelism, people who has a good understanding of concurrency. So you can see that the suddenly a lot of things changed after 2006 7 actually, uh, after the introduction of these multi-core systems in the market. Okay, so let us summarize the important things till now. So the most important points. So the first important point is serial performance scaling is over. Cannot continue to scale processor frequencies. No 10 gigahertz chips in future. So we are not going beyond 3-4 gigahertz in future. Cannot continue to increase power consumption. Otherwise it will melt the chip. So power is also more or less stabilized. However, we can continue to increase transistor density as per Moore's law. So every 2 years you can double almost. So that's going to happen. So only way to accommodate that is keep on increasing the number of cores. Okay. So we must rethink our algorithms to be parallel. So we need to learn parallel program. Okay, so that is like to summarize that why parallel programming has become absolutely necessary actually in today's context. Okay, now I'm going to do a very brief review of the trends actually, because we are not going to spend too much time on this. So this review I have taken from this paper. So you can also look into this paper. This is a very good paper and quite exhaustive in nature. So the title of the paper is The Landscape of Parallel Computing Research, a View from Berkeley. So what this paper addresses is actually why parallel computing, what should parallel computing achieve, and which disciplines parallel computing should address. So I'm just going to share with you some of the very important I mean information which is available in this paper. So we'll just look into that. Uh, so let's just take into the shift actually, how this overall trend shifted over the years. So initially, the conventional wisdom was that the power is free and transistors are expensive. And now it's absolutely opposite. So now transistors are free. I mean, it's very cheap and power is expensive. So this is called the power one. Okay. The second point is that uniprocessor performance. So that is single processor performance doubles every 18 months. So that's the Moore's law. But now that is not happening. Now doubling uniprocessor performance may take 5 years as per recent trend when this paper was written. And remember, this uniprocessor performance does not only come from the processor frequency. I mean, there are many other things which contributes to us improving the performance of a processor. So we'll look into that. But one thing is very clear that it's not going to follow Moore's law. So the processor performance, uniprocessor performance, is very difficult to increase now. I mean, significant. And we can see there are three important valves actually. So this is the first valve, that is the power valve, which we just discussed. The second wall is called memory wall. We'll look into details as we go forward. This is very important point. I mean, how should we optimize our codes to address this memory wall problem? And the third one is ILP, which is instruction level parallelism. And this is the first idea. If we understand it properly, it will help us a lot in really understanding parallel algorithms. Okay, so and overall we call this a brick wall. Okay, now let's look into the. I'm just keeping the third point. Let's come to the important ones. So the fourth point. Fourth point is multiply functional unit is slow, but load and store memory operations are fast. However, now it is absolutely different actually. So what is happening? There is a increasing DRAM gap. We'll understand this point. What do we mean by DRAM gap? So there is a gap between the processor and the memory. So load and store are much slower than floating point multiplication. So your compute part is much faster compared to your accessing the memory part, and that is called the memory wall. So you can see the memory is creating problem actually, that you are not able to access the memory as fast as your processor can crunch numbers for you. So that is creating another wall, which is memory wall. Instruction level parallelism. So instruction level parallelism can be achieved through several mechanisms like out of order execution, speculation, loop, unrolling. Some of these techniques actually we'll discuss in this course, particularly from programming perspective. How do we do this? So, so now we can see that there is a diminishing results of ILP, because when ILP initially it used to give very good performance, but now in many core architectures it's not working so nicely. So there is a ILP wall as well. Okay, and I mean, these are a couple of things which we have already discussed, like increasing in. So conventional wisdom in the old days was like, old days means 20 years back, increase in frequency is primary method, but now that's not going to work actually, because otherwise we'll burn the processor. So only way to get performance is increasing parallelism. Now parallelism in both actually, in the multiple processors as well as through programs. The software which we develop, those should be able to utilize those parallel architecture. Uh, Earlier, it was like less than linear scaling in performance for multiprocessor application is a failure. So what do you mean by linear scaling? So linear scaling is something like this actually. I can draw it for you. So sorry, it is not really linear. So let's say this is. I mean, yeah, yeah, yeah. So this is difficult. Yeah. So like if we increase the number of processors, so this is P here, this is the number of processors P, and this is the speed up. So if you increase the number of processors, you should get a speed up which is almost proportional to number of processors. So that is called linear scaling. So conventional wisdom was that you should always achieve linear scaling, otherwise you are actually not utilizing the resources. But now the shift in that thought process is that any speed up via parallelism is a success. So even if you don't get a linear speed up, so say your curve is something like this, I mean, so that's also a relatively, I mean, good achievement. Okay, so that these are some of the important points, I mean, which I have just taken from that paper, but you should go through that paper. That's very informative. Other important points which are there in that paper is that So typically, how should you look into this? I mean, when you are looking from an application point of view, so generally what happens, there are several kinds of applications which can be classified into different domains, like say embedded computing, general purpose computing, machine learning, graphics and game, and databases. Okay. Now, each application domain has several kinds of examples, like embedded computing may consist of all these things like I mean, entertainment, consumer, text processing, etc. General purpose computing, which is one of the focus of this course, definitely computational science, fluid dynamics, molecular dynamics, computational electromagnetics. So that is where the general purpose computing comes in picture. We know about machine learning, which is getting very popular. So primarily linear algebra, I mean, support vector machine principle, component analysis, so matrix and vectors. How do you deal with them? Then there are graphics and game and all those things, robotics, and then databases. Now, so these are the application areas. So that is like the main applications. Now, what is important is uh, if you look into this. So behind any application, you take any of these application, you take let's say general purpose computing or machine learning. So behind any application, there are numerical algorithms. So those numerical algorithms are basically called the kernels, the common kernels or dwarfs. Okay. So total 14 such dwarfs have been identified in that paper. The first seven are very important, particularly keeping in mind the focus of this course, which is more for computational science. So these dwarfs are basically, the first important dwarf is dense linear algebra. So you are talking about matrices which are really filled actually. So densely populated matrices. Okay, and then we need to learn the techniques how to parallelize, let's say matrix, which is very important. How to parallelize matrix operation, how to parallelize matrix vector or vector. So we'll spend a significant amount of time in understanding how to parallelize these kernels actually, or these dense linear algebra dwarfs, or you can say algorithms for dense linear algebra. Then there are sparse linear algebra, which are basically sparse matrices. Then spectral methods. I mean, these are very useful for solving differential equations, FFT. Okay, n-body methods. These are typical scientific problems, which is very powerful techniques. Then there are structured grids and unstructured grids. Um, if you have done a modeling course, you will know what are these things. And then there are other important dwarfs like Monte Carlo. We will also look into this, how to parallelize these Monte Carlo simulations, which is again very easy to parallelize because this falls under this category, embarrassingly parallel category. And then there are other dwarfs. I'm not going into the details, but this first seven kernels or dwarfs covers most computational science applications. And then there are a lot of others dwarfs like combinational logic, graph traversal, dynamic programming, and graphical models, finite state machines. So I'm not going into the details. All the details are given in this paper. So once again, I will like to reiterate. So this is the paper, The Landscape of Parallel Computing Research, a View from Berkeley. Okay. Now, why we are looking into this so carefully? Because we have to really understand the approach. So the approach is to learn how to parallelize some algorithms. Let's say you know how to parallelize dense linear algebra algorithm, and then you will see that that has applications in almost most of those fields actually, the applications. So the on the top side you have applications like embedded computing, general computing, machine learning, graphics and game, databases. Now if you know how to parallelize dense linear algebra routines, or how to deal with, how to develop parallel dense linear algebra algorithms, then that is useful in all these applications. Similarly, if you know how to do sparse linear algebra using parallel algorithms, then those skills are applicable in all the important application areas. So again, this is from the same paper. I mean, this is a very nice way to look into this, because what it tells is that we'll just focus on the primary kernels. We'll just understand how to write a parallel code for those kernels, and then we don't need to worry about the applications, and we can apply those skills in any applications actually, wherever those kernels are used actually. Okay. Uh, Up to this point, everything is clear.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Perfect. Okay. Now let's look into the challenges. I mean, what are the important challenges in designing parallel algorithms? So, one of the challenges to really understand the architecture, not all the details, but the important ones, which leads to a significant rise in performance, which a programmer should know actually. The parts of the architecture which the programmer should really understand if he or she wishes to improve the performance of a code. Otherwise it's very difficult. So that those are the areas what that is one challenge. The programmer also needs to know about some important details of the architecture, so how to use architecture and programming model tuned in individual kernels draws for combination design. Now this is another important thing, that when you talk about applications, let's say you're talking about some applications, they may involve several dwarfs. So that may involve dense linear algebra as well as sparse linear algebra. It may also involve Monte Carlo, or it may also involve structured grids. So when you are designing an application, a parallel application, you have to apply several such techniques to develop that code actually. And the second point is algorithm implementations for different kernels. So these kernels which I discussed have different, I mean, preferred data structure. So suppose some algorithms will work perfectly well with say arrays. Some algorithms may need a different kind of data structure which for performance improvement. So how do you use a combination of different drops for different data structures? So that is another important point. I mean, these are main challenges when you look from a application point of view. But in this course, actually, we'll just focus more on these individual kernels actually, instead of looking too much into the applications. One can do an application during the project, but during the course, we'll focus on the kernels actually, the basic building blocks, and then one can combine those blocks to develop an application. Okay. Now, again, this is a very important slide. I mean, this is going to tell us about the important terminology we are going to use throughout this course. Particularly, we'll be learning techniques for both the systems, the shared memory system, distributed memory system. So let's look into the terminology very carefully. So the basic unit, so actually you can look into it as levels actually. So let's say level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4. So at the very basic level you have actually instructions. So that's you can say some kind of a level 1 actually, the instruction level. So how can you improve the performance at the instruction level itself? The second level is actually the thread level. So that is like the course comes into picture, the course, the single core. So this course actually performs floating point operations for us. So the first level you can visualize it as instruction level. The second level is like the thread level, and you can, if you want to correlate this to architecture, then it is course actually. So these terminologies are actually from architecture point of view. So the course. So you can say that course are the first level from the architecture point of view. A processor contains, now there comes the processor. So processor contains one or more cores. Okay, so the basic building block is core. You combine several cores, you get a processor. A socket holds one processor. So then there is a socket which will just hold one processor. And when you combine several such sockets, you get a node. Okay, so basically a supercomputer is a combination of several nodes, a supercomputer or a high performance computing cluster. So you'll be provided a access to a HPC cluster for the later part of the course. So there actually what you are working with is a combination of several nodes. So initially we'll start with here, we'll write codes So that is like a serial code. We'll try to understand the performance of a serial code. So that will run on a single core. Then we are going to write some codes which are going to run on a processor which has multiple cores. And this is where we are going to use OpenMP. Then gradually we'll go to this node actually, where there are several nodes connected with each other, and each node can have multiple processors. I will again explain it through visually also in my next slide. So in the HPC world, node peak theoretical performance. This is very important. So like if someone asks us like what is the performance of your cluster, HPC cluster. So basically what we do is like you calculate the node peak theoretical performance. So in our previous lecture, we already discussed how to calculate the peak theoretical performance of a single processor. So this part we did actually in our previous lecture. So now you can simultaneously similarly you can also calculate the peak theoretical performance for a node which can have more than one processor, and also similarly for a supercomputer which can have several nodes actually. Okay, so for CPU programming, we generally use MPI and OpenMP. These are very well accepted standards in academia as well as research. For GPUs, we use a very well accepted framework which is CUDA programming model. So in this course, we are going to focus on MPI and OpenMP. Yeah, this is a question. Can someone tell me how many cores we need for 1 teraflop? Suppose your cores are 2.5 gigahertz.
Uh, 100.
100. So one core is giving you how much gigaflops? One core
10 gigaflops.
exactly. So if so 10 to the teraflop is 10 to the power 12. So that makes sense. Yeah. Okay. So now you know how to calculate the number of cores. So if you know, so that gives us an understanding that if I want to build a teraflop supercomputer using CPUs, I'm not talking about GPUs, just using CPUs. You want to build a 1 teraflop computer using CPUs, then how many cores are required? Similarly, you can figure out how many cores are required for a petaflop computer, and similarly for a exaflop computer. I mean, you will require some millions of cores if you want to go to exascale computing. Okay, so that's the summary actually. Now let's look into this one. It's very important that we really know our system very nicely. So if you really look into the hardware, so in the so this is the hardware actually, this part. So now I look into it very carefully, and then we'll look into this side later on. So this part actually, this part, so this is like your processor. Okay, so here you can see you have two processors. So now this processor, so this CPU or processor, or they actually sit on socket. So these are basically the sockets actually. So you can see processor 1, processor 2, or you can say socket 1, socket 2. Now when you combine these things together, then you get a node. So this one is actually a node. So you can see this is actually a node. Okay, so this node has two sockets. Each socket has one processor, and when you combine many such nodes, so each blue color here, you can see a blue color here, these blue colors. So when you combine several such nodes, you get a supercomputer. Okay, so there are like different levels, and we need to learn techniques when you operate at those different levels. So there is a core, so that is like a thread level programming, thread level parallel programming. Then gradually you go to a cluster. I mean, so that is like combination of several nodes actually, and then we need to use some other frameworks, which is a distributed system actually, because all these nodes are actually connected through a switch actually. We'll go there gradually. Okay, but on a given node you have a single operating system. Okay, and interestingly, the same parallel program which we are going to write can be executed on a laptop, on a multi-core laptop, and can be also executed on a supercomputer. So the same code, I mean, so that's called the portability actually. So I mean, your code should work on both kinds of all kinds of systems if it is a multi-core system. Now let's understand this point very carefully. So if we consider that this is our basic building block, which is a core. So typically a core has three important components. One is the execution units, then registers, and then cache. Caches are very important actually. We'll understand why they are so important. And then when you look into this part, this part, so these are basically processor or socket. So here when you combine several cores, you get a processor. And then these cores can have a shared cache. Okay, so each core has its own cache, which is this one, the blue color. And then when you combine several such cores, you can have another level of cache, which is like a shared cache. And then all this is connected to a memory actually. So this is your RAM actually. Okay, so we really need to understand this hierarchy actually, that there is a memory hierarchy. Like you have registers, you have cache, then you have shared cache, then there is memory, and then there are number of cores. And when you are writing a parallel code, it should utilize everything in a very synchronized fashion to get the best performance out of it. This part is clear to all of you? This part is clear?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Any questions, you should really stop me at this point, because this is a very, very important slide actually to really understand the machine where you are going to work. All of you, this is clear? Okay.
सर
Okay.
वो राइट
Yes.
साइड में कैश और शेयर कैश के बीच में एक जो रिलेशन था दैट आई मिस्ड आई थिंक.
Yeah. So what we are saying is that this core, so this is like, let's say this is the basic block. Let's say that this is the basic unit. The core is the basic unit of
बेसिक.
your computer architecture. So each core has its own cache.
ओके.
Okay. It can have two levels of cache also. Let's say it can have L1 cache and it has L2 cache. Okay.
ओके.
And then when you are combining several cores together, so like if you look into this part actually, so this is a multi-core processor.
ओके.
Okay, now this can have several cores. Now what you are saying is that I'm going to introduce another level of cache where all these four can share. So
Okay.
this cache is only accessible to this core actually.
Yes.
So so I have some cache here which is only accessible to core 1. Core 2 cannot touch this core, this cache actually directly.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, but then there is a
So
shared cache which can be utilized by all the cores.
so share
And
cache is
yes,
add-on cache on the single unit. मतलब every core has its own cache plus shared cache.
exactly.
Okay.
Now this is
Thank you.
optional. I mean, so some processors have, some
Yes.
processors may not have.
Okay.
We'll gradually understand why caches are so important. I mean, why it plays one of the most important role in improving performance. But this is very, very important to understand that each core has its own cache, and
Yes.
then there are shared cache, which is being shared by several cores.
Okay.
And then on top of that, you have RAM.
Yes.
But the problem with RAM is that it is connected. You can see these black lines I have drawn, right? So this is connected through some kind of cable, actually bus.
Yes.
Okay, so it is like if there is a limitation in the bus, I mean those I mean through the channel through which the data is flowing, then the overall system can actually the efficiency of the overall processor depends on these channels actually, the you can say
Bus.
the tunnel through which the data flows. So and this memory, which is RAM actually, this is not sitting on the processor.
Okay.
That is the important point. So this cache, the shared cache, these are sitting on the processor, but this memory is not really sitting on the processor. That is outside the processor. You are connecting it to the processor using some data channels. So here yeah, I mean, I think somewhere here this RAM is there. I mean, you have different slots and you can just put those RAMs there, and then it is connected through a data channel. Okay, so this part is clear to all of you?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Okay. Now, uh, okay, this we have already discussed. Okay. Now, let's look into the modern processor and the principle of multiplicity actually. In the modern processor, what we should look into is that, I mean, a very abstract picture. So actually, one side we have this memory. Let me draw it actually a little bit. So one side I have this memory. Okay, and let me call it memory. Okay, and another slide actually, I have this. What do you call the processor? So let me call it P. And now these two are connected. So let me call it 1. Let me call it 2. And these two are connected. And let me call it 3. What is a data path? So let me call it a data path D. Okay. Now we can see there are multiple data paths. That's the challenge actually. So let me call it 3. So data path, because you have multiple memories. So there are multiple data paths. So on one side you have memory, another side you have processor, and then there is a third one, which is the data path. Now the overall bottleneck is always in this third one, which is this actually creates the main bottleneck, which is the memory bottleneck. Will come there. And how we address those bottlenecks, we use a principle of multiplicity. Will come there gradually. But before we really go there, it's really important to, I mean, just to once again brush up our memory on this, the stored, the single core architecture. How does a single core architecture? I mean, we know what are the important components, but how should I look into it? I mean, from a programmer's perspective, how should I really look into it? So this is called the von Neumann architecture. Okay, or we can say stored program digital computer. So here, why we call it stored program digital computer? Because instructions are stored as data in memory. Okay, so that's why I call it stored program digital computer, because instructions are stored as data in memory. Now we all know that typically this stored program digital computer. I mean, it has been almost 100 years, but nothing has changed here. It's still the same. I mean, architecturally the same thing. I mean, so it's a very nice design that I mean, whatever progress we have made in overall design of the computer system, but this basic design more or less remained intact. So what is this basic design? You have a control unit, you have a arithmetic and logic unit. So your control unit is responsible for reading instructions and executing it. Your arithmetic and logic unit is responsible for computation. Your memory, now this is the important point, your memory is responsible for storing data for both ALU as well as for control unit. And then you have a input output, I mean, that is communication with the user. So if I have to draw a diagram, how should I look it? So let's first draw the memory, because this is connected to both ALU and control unit. So if I draw this one, so let's say this is my memory. So let me draw it like this is my memory. Okay, now this memory is connected to the control unit. Okay, this is a control unit. And then this memory is also I mean, connected to let's say, let me draw another connection here. They is also connected to ALU. Okay, and then this is connected to input output. So this diagram all of us know, but still we should just revisit it a little bit. Now what is important here is that this is bidirectional. Okay, that ALU, which is actually doing the computation for you, the arithmetic and logical unit. So they read the data from memory, because memory stored data for ALU. So ALU reads the data from memory and then again writes it back to the memory. And sometimes this it does more writing than reading. In most of the algorithms, it does less reading and more writing. And then there is control unit, which is more like it is getting the data from the memory and to execute it. And then there is input output. Now you can see why the memory is playing such an important role, because it is connected to both ALU and CU, and if these paths are not very efficient, then there is going to be a big problem actually, and that is exactly what has happened actually. So that is what we need to understand. Okay, now if we extend that picture a little bit, so we can see that there is a instruction stream. So there is like these instructions which are actually going from memory to control unit, and then there is a data which is actually flowing from the memory to the ALU. So if I have to summarize this, I will say that there are two important streams actually. So one is instruction stream and another is data stream. So what I mean by stream here, so stream refers to a sequence or flow of either instruction or data operated on by the computer. Okay, now these two are very important to classify parallel computers into different categories. Okay, so this is very important to really understand that if you look into this diagram, there are two streams. One is the instruction stream, okay, and the second one is the data stream. So instruction stream is basically flow of instructions from main memory to CPU. So flow of instructions from main memory to CPU, and the data stream is basically flow of operands, that is the data, between processor and memory. This is bidirectional. Now these two streams can take two possible states. This is another important point, that these two streams, instruction stream and data stream, can take two possible states. So I can basically draw some kind of diagram like this. Okay, now what are those two possible states? Single state and multiple state. So if both of them, so instruction stream is also single, data stream is also single, so you get something called SISD, single instruction, single data. Okay, now this is our conventional computer system. Conventional means traditional system where you have only one core. So single instruction, single data. So it is just getting only one instruction and you're operating on one data. Okay, now the second thing what I can make is like single instruction. I'm getting single instruction. So instruction stream is just taking the first state, which is single state, but data is taking multiple states. So I'm getting single instruction, multiple data. These are basically the vector processors actually. These are very useful nowadays. I mean, the GPUs particularly use on this are based on this philosophy. So single instruction, multiple data. So you're getting a single instruction but operating on multiple data. The third thing is like you can do is like single or let's say multiple instruction. So now I'm making instruction multiple and then we are doing single data. Now we can see that this is going to be very stupid to design a computer which is based on this philosophy, that you are getting multiple instruction and then you're trying to operate on the single data, knowing the fact that your memory is slow actually. So typically you don't design computer on this philosophy. The fourth philosophy is like multiple instruction. You have multiple instructions and then you have multiple uh, um, data streams actually. And this is again very useful, this MIMD philosophy. So shared memory distributed are primarily based on. So these are two important philosophies of today's computers actually: single instruction, multiple data, or multiple instruction, multiple data. This part is clear to all of you?
Yes.
Yes. Any question up to this point? This is a very important slide actually, that how you classify parallel computers. So always remember these things, that there are two streams: instruction stream, data stream. They can take two possible steps, either single state or a multiple state. And then based on that, I can come up with four permutation combinations. So single instruction, single data, single instruction, multiple data, multiple instruction, single data, and multiple instruction, multiple data. This is almost useless. This is the traditional computer, single instruction, single data. This is very useful. GPUs and vector processors are based on this philosophy. And MIMD is, yes, it's very useful, particularly when you have multiple instructions like different nodes, you are operating with several nodes. Okay, so that tells us about the different kinds of computer systems we have available today, and how, now we need to learn how to work with these systems actually. Okay, now the next point is from where the performance is coming. So over the years, what changes have been done actually to get this performance? So something definitely has come from the device technology. So I'm not going into that. So I mean several important I mean improvements have been made there. I mean logic switching speed, device density, memory capacity, and access time, communication bandwidth and latency. So improving communication bandwidth and latency. So this is more from the hardware side. The device technology itself has improved, and so therefore we have got performance from there. What are the interesting things which has happened over the years in the architecture side? So one is this pipeline. So this is the first idea, I mean, which will really help us in thinking in parallel to this pipeline, if you really understand how pipeline works. And the second important is cache management. So earlier, I mean, there were no such thing called cache, and gradually cache got introduced. And over the years, I mean, there are multiple levels of cache. Each has different access time and different size to keep data. The challenge is how do we really design our code so that it can utilize this cache actually. And sometimes if you really know how to utilize this cache, I mean, with simple modifications you can make your codes almost 2 times faster. So if something is taking 2 hours, you can reduce it to 1 hour. Okay, so this is very important, which you really need to understand as we go forward. And then there is this parallelism. So parallelism is number of operations per cycle per processor. So there is instruction level parallelism. So if I really look it into 3 levels, so you can parallelize the code in 3 levels. So the first level is instruction level, the second level is the thread level, and the third level is basically the node level. Okay, so and in this course we are going to learn about all these 3 techniques actually. How to parallelize a code at thread level. First we'll learn about thread level, and gradually how do we parallelize it at node level. So number of processors per node, and then number of nodes in a system. So that is the node level, and here I mean number of processors, or you can say number of cores per processors, and then you can have multiple processors there. Okay, this part is clear to all of you? This part is clear? Yes. Okay, now the next job is actually to understand uh, uh, 2 important things actually. So first we should really understand, uh, let me just write a simple loop for you. Okay, let me write a do loop for you. Today this pen is not working properly. Okay. Okay, now if you look into this simple do loop, which is like you are adding 2 numbers, I mean 2 vectors, let's say B and C, and you are getting it stored in A, and you have I starting from 1 to N. Okay, now if you look it from programmer's viewpoint, you just look into the flops. I mean, how many flops I am doing. So if my N is like, let's say 10 to the power 6, then you will say that I am doing 10 to the power 6 floating point operations. Okay, and that's all. I mean, you are not going to look into anything beyond that. And then what you are trying to do is like you're trying to evaluate some time, how much your code is taking. So you can put a timer here. You can see the start time and the end time here, and then you will calculate how much time this part of the code took. So let's say this is a small function or subroutine, whatever, and then you can calculate how much time this particular part took, and then you can say the performance, let's say PER, the performance is equal to the floating point operations which you did. So that is like, let's say 10 to the power 6 operations you did, and whatever time you took, that is in second. So this time is in seconds, and then you will say that this is the performance of my code. So in per second I did this much. Now you ask a computer architect to look into the same code, he or she will look into it in a very different way. They are not going to look it into flops. Actually, the flops are for people like us, I mean, who are really programmers. Actually, they will look at it from instruction perspective, actually, that how many instructions are being done to complete this job, actually, to execute this subroutine or even a program of which has a loop, actually, do I work to 1 to n. Now when you look into the instruction part, I mean, just if you think about an instruction, let's say instruction. Now what does an instruction involve? I mean, to complete the instruction, what are the important steps involved? Can someone tell me?
Reading data, then
Yeah,
um,
so that is like load, store,
first,
execute. Reading data and executing it, right?
yes.
Okay, so the point is the runtime. So the runtime which you are talking about, the runtime which I am talking about, okay, this runtime really has two components. This has the data read data component, read write data component. So data component plus the, I mean, you can say the data transfer. Let me write it in a more broad way. So data transfer component. Okay. Then it has the code execution component. Code execution. And let's say we can keep something as miscellaneous also. So if we really want to improve the overall runtime, I have to work on all these three fonts. I have to make sure that the data transfer component takes less time, as least as possible. Code execution, which is more like the algorithmic side, actually, how do you design the right algorithm. And then there can be miscellaneous components, particularly in parallel computing. I mean, you'll see, I mean, there may be a lot of other things which may come in. Now, here is a very important thought, actually, which we really need to understand, that this instruction and data must be given continuously to the control unit and arithmetic and logic unit. So if I go into this diagram, actually, so you can see this instruction and the data both has to be given continuously to the control unit and the arithmetic and logic unit. But the problem is the speed of memory interface poses a limitation on computer performance. So this part is the main problem, that the speed of memory interface. So it is like they are like three friends: memory, control unit, arithmetic and logic unit. They are going for jogging, and if someone is slow, the whole thing will come down, actually. So that's exactly what happens, and that is what we call von Neumann bottleneck, or the memory wall. So the bottleneck is that we are not able to give data continuously to the arithmetic and logic unit, okay, at the required speed, actually, and that's where the whole problem starts, actually. So so one of the challenges, how do we address that, this bottleneck, what we call a von Neumann bottleneck? Now I will just briefly introduce some of the techniques which are used to improve performance. So one of the things which I mentioned in the very beginning, actually, that this principle of multiplicity. Now what multiplicity we are talking about actually. So we are talking about uh, today's system, which has multiple processors, which has multiple memories, and which has multiple data paths. So everything is multiple. You have multiple processor, you have multiple data path, and you have multiple memory. So this is memory, multiple memory. You have multiple processors and multiple data paths, and we have to work on all these 3 points. And how do you do that? Some of the important thing, I mean, just to look from a single core perspective, then there is pipeline, there is out of program order, out of execution, out of order execution. Then there are catch. Then there are single instruction, multiple data. So which is again a single core thing because there is only single instruction. So first we really need to understand these points, and then gradually we will be able to look into the real parallel programming part. So maybe in the next lecture I will start on this part, this pipeline and the catch actually, but we'll take a very mathematical way to look into these things actually, rather than a more architectural viewpoint. Um, so if you have any questions, you can ask me now, whatever we have discussed today.
Hello, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Sir, can you open the slide in which number of cores were required? That last question was that how many cores are required to achieve 1 tera?
Oh, okay. Yeah, just a minute. I can stop the